Why don't all Star Wars tanks use repulsor lifts to hover? Did the rebels have real main battle tanks? And what are these tanks and whom do they belong to? We look at all of this and much more in today's 50 Facts video about the tanks of the Star Wars universe. We look at different tanks from the Republic, the Empire, the Rebels, the Separatists, and more factions. So let's not waste any of our time and start with the first fact. Almost every faction in Star Wars used one tank or another. However, I'm going to exclude walkers like the AT-TE or the AT-AT. Even though they are probably a type of walking tank, we'll focus exclusively on tanks in the more traditional sense. Which is not all that easy in Star Wars, because there were tracked tanks, but there were also other tanks lifted up by repulsor lifts. Tracked tanks existed in virtually every era of the Star Wars galaxy, and in every faction. The Separatists had the Persuader tank, the Rebels had various tanks from the TB series, and the Empire had the TIE Crawler and TIE Mauler. But tanks with repulsor lifts were also widespread. The Republic had the TX-130, the Separatists had the AAT, the Rebels other tanks from the TB series, and the Empire, for example, had the 2M tank. Repulsor lifts ensured that these vehicles could hover just above the ground. This meant they needed neither wheels nor tracks. And just above ground can mean a few centimeters to a few meters, depending on the power of the repulsor lift. We never received precise information on this, but it seems that both means of movement are suitable for tanks. I can imagine that the tracks of such a tank were much easier to repair and maintain than a repulsor lift. A repulsor lift drive, on the other hand, had the advantage of protecting such tanks from many environmental influences. It didn't matter whether the ground was flat and dry or swampy, full of rubble, boiling with lava, or even across quite deep bodies of water, such vehicles could drive without any problems. The biggest problem here was probably just the price and the difficulty of maintenance. While tracks, for example, could be repaired or partially replaced relatively easily, even in dangerous situations, this was not nearly as easy with repulsor lift. But let's move on to the various individual tanks, and let's start with the Republic's TX-130. This was just over 8 meters long, 3.05 meters wide, and 2.3 meters high, and was powered by repulsor lifts. These TX-130 Saber tanks were equipped with good but light armor, which also allowed them high speed and maneuverability. For their protection, they were also equipped with their own shield generator. These tanks were manned by 4 people, 2 pilots, a gunner, and a commander. They were armed with 2 heavy laser cannons, a medium twin laser cannon turret, and 2 launchers of various types. These could include grenade launchers, but also rocket launchers. Thus, they also brought a lot of oomph to the battlefield. But now to the TX-130's counterpart among the Separatists, the AAT. At 9.19 meters long, this one was a good meter longer than the TX-130. We don't have any information on possible shields for this one, but we do know that its armor was quite strong, and that with a heavy laser cannon, 4 side-mounted laser cannons, and 6 energy projectile launchers, it was significantly more heavily armed than its Republic counterpart. Interestingly, the AAT was also manned by 4 individuals. Here with only 1 pilot, 2 gunners, and 1 commander. These could be battle droids or organic beings. But of course, that wasn't the only tank the Separatists had. They had much bigger things to offer, and even tanks that were almost like super weapons. First, we have the Defoliator tank, which was built on the basic structure of the AAT. At 12.53 meters, this was longer than the AAT and armed quite differently. Its armament included 2 laser cannons mounted on the side, 2 anti-personnel lasers, and 6 energy projectile launchers, as well as the eponymous Defoliator missile launcher on top, whose projectiles could set huge areas ablaze. Even more powerful than this defoliator tank, however, was undoubtedly the very creatively named Super Tank of the Separatists. This adopted design elements from the aforementioned AAT and the MTT, but was only 12.6 meters long. However, it had armor and shields that were almost impossible to penetrate with conventional weapons. The fearsome thing about this tank was its invulnerability, combined with its powerful weapons. Among these weapons were 2 twin blaster cannons, 2 twin laser cannon turrets, and a hidden twin missile launcher. To deploy the missile launcher, however, a hood on top of this tank had to be opened, which then exposed a weak point in the tank, which could ultimately destroy it. I've already mentioned the MTT, the Multi-Troop Transport. This was a Separatist armored personnel carrier that was almost 36 meters long. It could carry up to 112 B-1 battle droids or 12 B-2 super battle droids. And it was also armed with 2 heavy rotating blaster cannons. In total, it could carry 100 tons of cargo. Now that we've looked at the tanks of the Republic and the Separatists, let's move on to the tanks of the Rebels and the Empire. The Empire initially continued to use some of the Republic's tanks. For quite a long time, they even had the TX-100. But over time, the Empire also developed newer tanks. These included the repulsor-powered 2M Saber tank and the tracked TX-225 GAVW Combat Assault tank. Both seem to be somewhat related to the TX-130, based on their names. The 2M in particular bears a strong resemblance to the old Republican tank. We don't know much about it other than it was 10 meters long and armed with a medium twin laser turret, 2 heavy laser cannons and 2 rocket launchers. The tracked TX-225 tank was just 7.3 meters long and only 1.82 meters high and deep. In total, it was armed with 3 medium laser cannons and was manned by 3 people, a commander, a driver, and a gunner/technician. What was special about this tank was that its small size offered little surface area for attack. At the same time, it could still carry a considerable amount of cargo on its rear, allowing it to serve as support and supply for other units. In Legends, we also know of 2 other Imperial tanks that ran on tracks and were attached to the TIE Starfighter series, the TIE Mauler and the TIE Crawler. The Mauler was also relatively small at 6.7 meters long. However, it could reach a remarkable speed of 90 km per hour, and could therefore be quickly brought onto the battlefield by just one pilot with its triple blaster. Due to its light armor and equally light armament, it was primarily used as a scout and anti-infantry unit. The TIE Crawler was even more similar to the standard TIE Fighter, as it consisted of a spherical cockpit attached to 2 large tracked suspensions. This one too was just 6.7 meters long, but armed with a light turbolaser cannon and 2 medium blasters. The light turbolaser cannon is remarkable, making it one of the most heavily armed tanks we've looked at so far. Such turbolaser cannons were usually installed on capital ships hundreds of meters long. Of course, Star Destroyers had heavy versions of them, but corvettes and frigates were equipped with lighter turbolasers, and this TIE Crawler received exactly such a weapon. But it wasn't only the Empire that had tanks on its side. The Rebels also had a large arsenal of tanks at their disposal. Of course, the Rebels used just about anything they could get their hands on. But the aforementioned TB series was typical of the Rebel Alliance. You've already heard a lot about the TB series tanks previously in this video, so we'll now look at other tanks like the Mandalorian's tanks, because they also built their own tanks. Among them is the Canderous class assault tank. We don't know exactly how big it was, but we do know that it was armed with 2 mass driver cannons and an impact rocket launcher, a pretty powerful weapon. They were also equipped with extremely strong armor that could easily keep up with that of an AT-AT, and they also had shields. However, these tanks were extremely expensive, which meant they were only produced in small numbers and used only by the Mandalorians and a few wealthy moguls. But not only these main factions had tanks, there were also some tanks used by other factions, some of them even by crime cartels. Depending on how you define tanks, armored and armed skiffs, which were very popular across the galaxy, can also fall into this category. The Panther II model, for example, was a skiff that could be armed with 3 blaster turrets, but it wasn't heavily armored and didn't have shields. However, there was a heavily armored version of the skiff, which I would classify as a tank. A significantly heavier repulsor tank variant, often used by pirates, was the WL-05 variant. We know that these were manufactured by Ubrikian Industries, but we don't have much of a backstory on them. What we do know is that they were 11.47 meters long and could reach speeds of up to 110 kilometers per hour. They were also equipped with a heavy laser cannon and 2 anti-personnel blasters. Even more powerful, however, was the Mirson rocket launcher. This could anchor itself in the ground and then cause serious problems for its enemies with 3 rocket launchers. We also know, however, that some crime syndicates converted old Separatist MTTs and used them as tanks. Otherwise, we know about the mobile pulse cannon of the MZ8 series, for example. We don't know much about this, only that it ran on tracks, was heavily armored and armed with a heavy plasma launcher. This one was manufactured by U-Train Tricata, the same manufacturer that also produced the Rebels TB series. These were some really cool tanks, but did you know that the Empire did not only have walkers like the AT-AT and AT-ST, but also a literal missile platform, or the smaller, smarter walker? If you want to learn more about them, watch the 50 facts video about the walkers linked here in the end card. Have a great day and may the Force be with you.